I used to tell myself that loneliness in a marriage was just a phase that came with being busy and stressed, but as I sat at our kitchen table that early in the morning watching the faint glow of sunrise, I couldn't get rid of the emptiness. Mark, my husband of almost 20 years, was still sleeping upstairs, and our house felt as quiet and still as a graveyard. On paper, Mark was everything a woman could want: steady, dependable, and caring as an oak. He was my safety net and my tree in a storm, but somewhere along the line, that strength and stability turned into a sort of silence. Where we used to laugh and talk for a long time, there was now a wordless void between us, something hollow that grew. As the years went by, we weren't unhappy. Rather, it seemed like we had found a comfortable distance between two different worlds that occasionally overlapped. At that point, my nephew Theo asked if he could stay with us for a while, fresh out of art school. He was lively, talented, and Theo was like a whirlwind, sweeping into our quiet house with his brushes, canvases, and sketchbooks. He had a habit of turning every flat surface into a workbench or a place to prop up his art. He was completely unsure of his next steps, so I welcomed him with open arms in the hopes that his presence would shake things up a bit. In just 1 week, our home felt different. Messy, yes, but alive in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Theo was a natural charmer, and soon enough, he was bringing his friends around, some of whom were musicians. They would gather in our living room, sprawled out on couches, their laughter resonating late into the night, and Mark would frequently excuse himself after a while, retreating to our room while I stayed up with them. One night, Theo introduced me to Leo, a friend from his photography class. Leo was different from the others, quiet but intense with a thoughtful gaze. Other writers and a few were just as lost as him, drifting in that in-it phase of life where you're still figuring yourself. We didn't talk much that night, but when he looked at me, something inside of me flickered. At first, I dismissed it as an innocent flutter that happens when someone new and interesting enters your life, but over the next few weeks, Leo became a regular presence, slipping into our lives as if he'd always been there. He had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, and his attention was unwavering. I told myself that it was just admiration or a little curiosity, but even then I could feel something developing between us. Mark was gracious, of course, and he liked Theo and his friends even if he didn't fully understand them, but I could sense his growing discomfort with how late I'd stay up with them or the way my laughter seemed to fill the room. He also captured moments with an effortless grace that made even the mundane seem beautiful. I tried to explain it to him once, saying that it was nice to have company and talk to people who were passionate and curious. He nodded, and his eyes had a distant look that made my heart twist. Around this time, Theo and I became close, and we would talk for hours about art and life, delving into topics I hadn't considered in years. It was thrilling to feel understood, as if he could see parts of me that had been hidden for too long. Intriguing once more, reminding me of the woman I was before I became someone's wife and everything, but there was another undercurrent that I didn't want to mention. I was his aunt. At times, though, he looked at me with such intensity that it left me gasping for air, as if there were things we were both trying to avoid saying. I laughed it off, told myself it was silly, but even now, as I write it down, I can still feel my heart pounding, that old thrill of forbidden curiosity resurfacing inside me. One evening, Theo chose to host a small party at our house. I remember the warmth of that night, the glow of the string lights that Theo had strung up across the living room, the way everyone laughed and talked over each other, each voice adding to the energy in the room. Mark had stayed up for a while, but eventually, as he often did, he excused himself to bed, leaving me and the others in the kitchen cleaning up after everyone had gone home. I turned, half expecting Theo, but instead I saw Leo leaning casually against the doorframe with a gentle smile on his lips. The room seemed smaller with him there, and the air was heavy with tension. He asked me if he could take my portrait, and although his tone was light, his eyes were intent. I laughed, half apprehensive, half flattered, and he insisted on coming closer, lifting his camera and focusing it on me. I held my breath, my heart racing, as he captured those silent, vulnerable moments, and when he finally lowered the camera, He looked at me for an excessive amount of time, his eyes searching as. That night, I found myself thinking about Leo more than I should have. His eyes, his quiet charm, and the way he could make a simple gesture feel like a promise left me feeling torn between my life and this strange, unexpected attraction that filled me with a thrill I hadn't felt in years. Even though he could see right through me, the moment lingered charged and raw before he smiled again and left, leaving me alone in the kitchen, breathless. Despite this, I kept it hidden under layers of guilt and practicality. Weeks passed, and life continued on, with the house filling and emptying with Theo's friends every night blending into the next. But I sensed something changing between us, a silent, dangerous understanding that persisted in every glance and hand-to-hand contact. And Leo had a way of unexpectedly entering my thoughts with a presence that was both reassuring and unsettling. I knew I was going over a line, but the allure was too strong to resist, and while Mark watched, he would ask cautious, probing questions as if possible. A part of me wanted to confess, tell him everything, and end this growing tension, but another part of me, the part that had kept Lane silent for years, wanted to keep this for myself. This spark of life had returned inside me, so I buried it in the hopeless hope that it would go away, but deep down I knew it wouldn't. After that night, it felt like I was living a double life every morning, waking up next to Mark while he made me feel uncomfortable. Coffee and carry on with our daily activities, but there was a thrill pulsing beneath the surface, a barely concealed fire that I kept hidden from him. I could still feel the memory of that night in the hot tub, every touch, every whispered word. I told myself it was a one-time mistake that I would brush off and move on from, but that didn't last. The three of us only grew stronger. Theo would smile at me from across the room or catch my eye during dinner, and Leo seemed to bring with him whenever he came by. It was a delicate dance that we performed under the guise of secrecy, hiding in plain sight, but the guilt weighed heavily every time Mark looked at me with those quiet, thoughtful eyes of his. I felt like I was betraying the stability he'd always given me. Mark had been my rock, my companion, and my safety net for so many years, and now I was risking all of that for something I couldn't explain, something that felt wild and freeing, but dangerous. When he asked me why I didn't join him for the evening news as I used to, or why I seemed distracted where I'd been when I'd stayed out a little too late, I initially dismissed it as work stress or made up innocuous excuses, but Mark was more perceptive than I'd given him credit for. I could see suspicion growing in his eyes as he watched me whenever Theo or Leo were around, and I could see the quiet weariness that persisted even in his silences. One evening, I discovered something that broke any illusions I had about keeping our secrets hidden. After Theo and his friends had gone to pick up stray wine glasses and snack plates, I was cleaning up when I noticed the subtle, unmistakable glint of a tiny camera hidden behind a picture frame in the living room. I looked around, suddenly realizing that Mark had been watching. How much had he seen, and did he know that I felt the walls of my carefully constructed world closing in on me? The excitement of our secret affair had been replaced by the harsh reality of exposure, and Mark had placed cameras. When I confronted Theo that night, after Mark had gone to bed, his face hardened as I explained what I'd found, his hand gripping mine with a protective urgency that almost made me forget the danger we were in. Had been my source of comfort and stability, watching my every move, invading my private moments with Theo and Leo. I felt betrayed and exposed. I was furious and guilty all at once. The thrill of it all was intoxicating, as was the touch of Theo's hand, the knowing glances we've shared, the warmth of his presence beside me, Leo, to become part of our covert world. He was just as careful, just as discreet, and we all shared this silent mutual. I agreed that the excitement of secrecy flaring back up despite my guilt was enhanced by our new arrangement, which made everything feel even more forbidden. We found ourselves meeting in quiet parks late at night or in empty cafes in parts of town we hardly ever visited. Theo suggested that we take a break from our usual routine and relax in the backyard jacuzzi on a chilly evening. We had been meeting in secret locations throughout the city, keeping our affair under wraps, but tonight felt different. The air was still a late autumn chill, and for once, the tension between us eased into something softer. Theo joined us just as the last rays of sunset slipped across the sky. The three of us slipped into the hot water, the steam rising around us like a veil, cocooning us in warmth as I sank back against the tub's edge. I watched the two of them settle on either side of me, Theo's hand finding mine beneath the water, Leo's gaze meeting mine over the bubbles, and that quiet moment with only the soft hum of the jacuzzi and the stars above it felt like the rest of the world fell away. Behind the trees, his usual quiet smile gave way to something heavier one. "You deserve better than this." Theo paused, a rare flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, and said, "I don't want to be the reason everything falls apart." His words hit me harder than I expected, stirring emotions I'd kept at bay. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low but firm, his eyes searching mine for vulnerability. For all the passion and excitement, Bae, I hadn't considered the toll it was taking on him and us. I had been so focused on my own needs and my own escape that I hadn't considered the weight he was carrying either. I squeezed his hand, my heart aching at the thought of losing him and giving up the part of me that he had brought back to life. Leo, who is always the one to keep us grounded, nodded slowly and calmly, but he was adamant that we're all involved in this and that we must decide what we want to avoid a terrible outcome for everyone. I felt myself sinking deeper into the realization of what we'd done as he looked at us both, his eyes steady, perhaps already having the truth of what he said hanging heavy in the air. I looked from Theo to Leo, my heart divided between the two of them and the life I'd left behind in my quest for something I couldn't even name. There was an unmistakable bond between us that went beyond simple attraction, but there was also a storm approaching, and I knew deep down that we couldn't hide from it forever. "What do we do?" I asked. "I can't let this go," I said softly, barely rising above the bubbling water. Leo's eyes softened, and for the first time, I noticed a flicker of sadness there, as if he had been preparing for the inevitable. "I don't think any of us can let go," he said, his hand finding my shoulder and providing a reassuring warmth against the cold reality that was settling in around us. "But we have to be realistic, because this can't stay hidden forever." Theo looked at me, his face displaying a mixture of fear and longing. Perhaps that's how he whispered. "I found a way for us to be together without destroying everything," but as he spoke, I noticed doubt flicker in his eyes, a shadow of the uncertainty that had been growing inside both of us. At that moment, I realized there were no simple answers. What we shared was intoxicating, even life-changing, but it was also precarious, hanging by a thread that could break at any time. The three of us sat there in that warm, quiet bubble, feeling the weight of everything pressing down, knowing that whatever happened next would be fatal. The water surrounding us cooled, but we remained there, each of us lost in our own thoughts and fears. Eventually, we fell into a heavy and comforting silence that contained every unspoken word and unresolved feeling. When I finally got up to leave, I realized that no matter what course we took, we would have to come to terms with what we had lost and what we stood to lose. For the first time, I realized that the thrill of secrecy could only last so long and that the life I had been trying to escape would. My clothes felt tighter, and my emotions seemed to simmer just beneath the surface, bubbling over without warning. At first, I dismissed it as stress because, after all, life had become one endless series of lies and near misses, with each encounter with Theo and Leo being a tangled mess of excitement and guilt that left me exhausted. However, when the nausea started to hit, I wasn't sure I could handle it. Refused to go away, and my body felt strange, so I couldn't ignore it any longer. One afternoon, I went out for errands and picked up a pregnancy test, feeling a wave of dread that I couldn't get rid of. The little box felt like it was burning a hole in my bag when I got home, as if carrying it was a confession in and of itself. That night, when the house was finally quiet and Mark had gone to bed, I locked myself in the bathroom and waited for the results, my heart racing. I had no idea what I wanted the test to say, and if it was positive, I'd be obligated to make a decision that could ruin everything. If it came out negative, I would be safe for the time being, but when the unmistakable blue line showed up, confirming my worst fear, reality set in. I was pregnant, and worse, I didn't know who the father was. Panic twisted through me like a vice, and I quickly wrapped the test in tissue and tucked it under the couch in the hopes that concealing it would somehow make it all go away. I told myself that I would figure it out some way, but for days I was unable to even look at Mark. When Mark confronted me that evening with the pregnancy test in his hand, his face was one of quiet devastation. Instead of yelling or accusing me, his voice was calm but edged with a hurt that went deeper than any anger. "Are you pregnant?" Mark's eyes were tight, and his voice was calm, but he had been growing more suspicious and watching me with a quiet intensity that I tried to ignore. I nodded, my breath catching in my throat as I felt imprisoned by his unwavering gaze. The silence between us was a wall of secrets and unspoken truths, and then he asked the question I had been dreading the most. "Is it even mine?" The air seemed to still around us, and every word sank into the silence like a stone. I opened my mouth to reassure him, telling him that he was the father and that it was his, of course, but the lie wouldn't come. All I could do was turn away, which confirmed my fears. Hardened a quiet storm that was simmering beneath the surface. He asked in a low-controlled voice, but it carried a weight that left me gasping for air. I felt my hands shake as I whispered the truth to Theo and Leo, and the words fell into the silence, like a confession I'd been holding back for far too long. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I never intended for it to go this far. Mark's expression broke into something raw, a mixture of hurt, anger, and disbelief that tore through me. He stepped back as though the distance. I don't know how to explain it, but it just happened. He stared at me for what seemed like an eternity, his face unreadable as he absorbed the weight of my betrayal, and then he exhaled a sound heavy with resignation. The days that followed were a blur of silence and distance, and Mark hardly spoke to me, strolling around the house like a snail. The pain in his eyes only made his voice barely more than a whisper. When the DNA results showed that the baby was Mark's, I felt a glimmer of relief and a glimmer of hope that perhaps we could somehow put the pieces back together, but when I told him, he just nodded, his face icy as if the damage had been done. Ghost. Every look was heavy with a mixture of anger and sorrow, and I felt the emptiness closing in around me. The thrill of secrecy had been replaced by the raw, painful truth of my choices, and his life was now hanging by a thread. Completed, we sat in silence together, both of us burdened by the reality of what lay ahead. I wanted to reach out and apologize for asking for forgiveness, but the gap between us felt insurmountable, a chasm I had created, and as I looked into his eyes, I realized that my confession had completely changed everything. In the silence of that broken moment, I realized that I had crossed a line that I would never be able to uncross, and that the life I had taken for granted was becoming increasingly out of reach following the DNA test. Every time I tried to talk to Mark to close the distance between us, he met me in silence, his eyes hardened by hurt and resentment. He had always been steady and forgiving, but this time, everything I had done had gone too far, and I felt the distance widening into a chasm that neither of us could heal. He wasn't just leaving me. He was taking our child, the last remnant of him that I had held onto, the one aspect of our life together that I dared to hope would survive. The legal proceedings were brutal, with each step serving as a painful reminder of how far we'd fallen from the life we once shared. Stark and devastating Mark were filing for custody of the baby, and he wanted full custody and a chance to raise the child free from the taint of my actions. I read the letter repeatedly, feeling my heart sinking with every word. Depicted me as unfit, pointing to my betrayal and the affair as evidence that I couldn't provide a stable home for our child. Of course, I was holding on to the hope that I could still be a mother and reclaim some of what I had lost, but I also felt that Mark's resolve was unwavering, driven by a quiet resolve that left no room for forgiveness. When the court decided in his favor, giving him full custody, it felt like a final blow had been dealt, one that left me feeling empty and hollowed out. The judge's words reverberated around me as I sat in that sterile courtroom, but it all felt far away and surreal. The knowledge that I had lost my child and would be an outsider in my own child's life was nearly too much to handle, and I returned to a home that no longer felt like mine. For a while, Theo and Leo tried to support me, each of them bound by the guilt we all carried. Theo would pause to offer comfort, his words soft but strained, as if he too was troubled by the weight of what we'd done. Theo moved out first, saying he needed space to find himself, but we both understood that he couldn't bear the sight of me of the reminders of the life we tried to create from lies and stolen moments. He also mentioned that he needed space to find himself, but I could see the strain wearing on him as well because of the subtle changes in his gaze when we spoke. The affair that had once bound us together had now become an unspoken burden that neither of them could carry for long, decreasing until they eventually stopped together, leaving me to struggle with the hollow echoes of what we had once shared. As a result, I was left alone in the quiet, empty shell of a life that had lost all meaning. The child I had imagined would have held the future I had once imagined had all been taken from me by my own decisions, and every morning I would wake up to the stillness and silence that pervaded the house, a constant reminder of the family I had destroyed. The ache was a dull pain that persisted in every room and corner as though the future. The walls themselves testified to my errors, and in that silence, I started to face the reality of what I had done. I had exchanged security for excitement, stability for a momentary thrill, and in the process, I had lost everything that had once given my life purpose. The decisions I had made and the lies I had told had left me standing in the wreckage of a life I would never be able to rebuild, and day after day, I battled the weight of it all, the loneliness, the grief, the hollow ache that pervaded every moment, and I had lost not only my child, but the man who had once been my Fulci. When the days turned into weeks, I realized that the only way forward was through the pain. There were no shortcuts, no easy answers, just the raw, unfiltered truth of what I had done in those quiet, solitary moments. The person who had supported me through everything until I broke the one bond that could never be repaired. I didn't know what lay ahead, whether there would ever be a chance for redemption or a way to piece together the fragments of my life. May find a way back to myself and a life that felt complete, even if it was eternally altered, but for now all I had was the quiet, the hollow echoes of a past I would never be able to take back, and the glimmering hope that one day I could muster the courage to go on.